She was chained beside a dead man on the wagon, and the widow held the key. Wyoming Territory, 1847. The iron shackles bit into Evangeline's wrists as the wagon lurched over another rock, and the corpse beside her shifted with a sickening thud. 3 days now she'd been chained to the body of Samuel Hartwell, the man who tried to steal her land. And 3 days she'd watched the mysterious widow in black hold the only key to her freedom. But what Evangeline didn't know was that beneath the floorboards of that very wagon lay a secret that would change the fate of the entire Montana goldfields forever. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty trail as the wagon train pressed westward through the Wyoming Territory. Evangeline Monroe pressed her back against the rough wooden slats, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the lifeless form of Samuel Hartwell. The dead man's face had turned a ghastly shade of purple, and flies buzzed persistently around his gaping mouth. "Please," she whispered hoarsely to the woman in widow's weeds who sat across from her, clutching a small brass key. "Mrs. Whitmore, you know I didn't kill him. These chains, they're cutting into my skin." Prudence Whitmore's pale blue eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her thin lips pressed into a hard line. The black morning dress she wore seemed to absorb the heat, yet she showed no signs of discomfort. "The sheriff and Laramie will sort this mess out, girl. Until then, you stay put right where you are." Evangeline's throat burned with thirst, but the water barrel remained tantalizingly out of reach. She'd been given only a few sips since they had shackled her to Samuel's corpse 3 days ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was dying of thirst while chained to the man who tried to steal her water rights. It had all started when Samuel Hartwell rode onto her property claiming he'd bought her land from the territorial office. Evangeline knew it was a lie. Her father had filed the proper claims before his death and she had the papers to prove it. But Samuel had powerful friends, and when she'd refused to vacate her homestead, he'd grown violent. The fight in her cabin had been brief but vicious. Samuel had lunged at her with a skinning knife, and in the struggle, he'd fallen backward onto her father's old hunting rifle. The weapon had discharged, sending a .050 caliber ball straight through his heart. By the time the wagon train had arrived to investigate the gunshot, Samuel lay dead in a pool of blood, and Evangeline stood over him with the smoking rifle in her hands. Self-defense. She'd pleaded with the wagon master, Jeremiah Cobb. But Mrs. Whitmore had whispered poison into his ear, and before Evangeline knew it, she was being shackled to the corpse as evidence. Now, as the wagon wheels creaked and groaned over the rough terrain, Evangeline studied her captor more closely. Prudence Whitmore claimed to be traveling to Oregon Territory to join her sister. But something about her story didn't add up. For one thing, her hands were too soft for a woman who'd supposedly worked a farm back in Missouri. And despite her mourning attire, Evangeline had never seen her shed a single tear for her supposedly deceased husband, Mrs. Whitmore. Evangeline tried again. "Surely you can see reason. I pose no threat chained up like this. At least give me some water." The widow's eyes flicked toward her, cold as Winter Creek water. "You killed a man in cold blood, girl. You're lucky we don't string you up from the nearest tree." It was self-defense. Evangeline's voice rose in desperation. "He came at me with a knife." "So you say, Mrs. Whitmore's fingers tightened around the key. But Samuel Hartwell was a God-fearing man, pillar of his community. What reason would he have to threaten the likes of you?" The wagon hit another rut and Samuel's arm flopped across Evangeline's lap. She recoiled in horror, but the chains gave her nowhere to go. The stench was becoming unbearable, and she could feel bile rising in her throat. "My land," she gasped. "He wanted my land. There's something on it he was after." For the first time since the journey began, Mrs. Whitmore's expression changed. A flicker of interest crossed her features before the mask of indifference returned. "What sort of something?" Evangeline hesitated. She'd sworn to her father on his deathbed that she'd keep the secret, but desperation was making her reckless. "Gold," she whispered. "There's gold on my property. Samuel somehow found out about it." The wagon fell silent except for the creak of wheels and the steady clip-clop of horses' hooves. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her pale eyes boring into Evangeline's. "Gold, you say, and how would you know such a thing?" "My father, before he died, he found a vein running through the creek bed. He made me promise never to tell anyone, Said it would bring nothing but trouble, but Samuel must have discovered it somehow. Mrs. Whitmore sat back, her expression unreadable. Interesting tale, girl. Convenient, too, seeing as how you're facing a noose. But Evangeline caught the calculating look in the woman's eyes. She was interested, very interested indeed. As the day wore on, the heat became oppressive. Evangeline's dress was soaked with sweat, and her lips had cracked from thirst. Samuel's body had begun to bloat, straining against his clothes. The smell was so overwhelming that she had to breathe through her mouth. Around midday, the wagon train stopped to rest the animals and take on water from a small creek. Through the canvas cover, Evangeline could hear the other travelers talking and laughing, the sound of children playing. She would have given anything to be out there in the fresh air instead of trapped in this rolling tomb. Mrs. Whitmore climbed down from the wagon, taking the key with her. "Don't get any ideas, girl," she warned. "I'll be watching." Alone with a corpse, Evangeline tried to think. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. She examined the shackles for the 100th time, but they were solid iron, designed to hold the strongest man. The chain was equally sturdy, and Samuel's dead weight made any attempt at movement nearly impossible. She closed her eyes and tried to remember everything her father had taught her about reading people. Prudence Whitmore was no grieving widow. That much was certain. But what was she, and why was she so interested in keeping Evangeline chained up? The answer came to her gradually. Like dawn breaking over the mountains. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just interested in seeing justice done. She was interested in that gold. But how could she get to it with Evangeline in custody? Unless she planned to make sure Evangeline never made it to Laram alive. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't about justice at all. Mrs. Whitmore was planning to let her die out here in the wilderness. Probably claimed she'd tried to escape and been shot. Then she'd be free to return to Evangeline's property and claim the gold for herself. But that raised another question. How did Mrs. Whitmore know about the gold in the first place? When the widow returned to the wagon, Evangeline was ready with questions. "Mrs. Whitmore, you never did say how you knew Samuel Hartwell. I told you he was a pillar of the community back in Missouri." "Funny thing about that," Evangeline said, watching the woman's face carefully. "Samuel told me he was from Kansas Territory." A muscle twitched in Mrs. Whitmore's jaw. "You must have misunderstood him." "I don't think so. In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if you two knew each other better than you're letting on." The widow's pale eyes flashed dangerously. "You're talking nonsense, girl. The heat saddled your brain." But Evangeline pressed on. "Samuel came to my property with a map. Crude thing, hand-drawn, showed exactly where the gold vein was located. Now, how do you suppose he got hold of something like that?" Mrs. Whitmore's hand moved instinctively to her reticule, and Evangeline knew she'd struck home. "The map was in that bag, or at least another copy of it." "You were working with him," Evangeline continued. "You and Samuel were partners. But something went wrong, didn't it? Maybe he tried to cut you out of the deal." "Shut your mouth, Mrs. Whitmore hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know you're no widow. I know you and Samuel plan to steal my land together, and I know you're planning to kill me before we reach Laramie." The wagon lurched forward as the train resumed its journey, but the silence between the two women was deafening. Mrs. Whitmore sat rigid as a poker, her knuckles white where she gripped the key. Finally, she spoke. "You're a clever little thing. I'll give you that. Too clever for your own good. So, I'm right. You and Samuel were partners." A bitter smile played at the corners of Mrs. Whitmore's mouth. "Partners. Yes, you could say that. Though Samuel always did think he was the brains of the operation." "What happened? Why did he go to my property alone?" "Greedy fool thought he could handle you himself. Claimed the whole find. Didn't trust me to keep my mouth shut if things got messy." Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was cold as mountain snow. Ironic considering how things turned out. Evangeline felt a chill despite the stifling heat. "You're going to kill me now. What would give you that idea?" But the widow's smile was predatory. "Accidents happen on the trail. People die of thirst, heat stroke, snake bite, all sorts of unfortunate circumstances. The wagon master won't stand for murder." "Who said anything about murder? You're a desperate woman chained to a rotting corpse." Stands to reason you might do something foolish. Try to escape perhaps, and if you were to be shot in the attempt, well, that's what happens to dangerous criminals. Evangeline's blood turned to ice. The woman had it all planned out, but there was still one thing that didn't make sense. How did you know about the gold in the first place? My father never told anyone except me. Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew distant, almost wistful. Your father was a good man, Henry Monroe. Honest to a fault, but he had one weakness. What are you talking about? He talked in his sleep, especially when he'd been drinking. The widow's smile was sharp as a blade. Amazing what pillow talk can reveal. The truth hit Evangeline like a thunderbolt. You knew my father. You were involved with him for 3 months back in Independence before he headed west. Sweet man, your father told me all about his dreams of finding gold in Montana Territory. Even drew me a little map of where he planned to search. Evangeline felt sick. Her father, the man she'd idolized, had been unfaithful to her mother's memory, and his betrayal had ultimately led to his daughter's doom. He never mentioned having a daughter. Mrs. Whitmore continued conversationally, quite a surprise when Samuel reported back that the claim was being worked by a young woman. Made things more complicated than we'd planned. So you sent Samuel to scare me off. We offered to buy you out fair and square first. Generous offer, too, but you were as stubborn as your father. Mrs. Whitmore shook her head sadly. Shame it had to come to this. The wagon creaked and swayed as they climbed a steep grade. Through the canvas, Evangeline could see rocky outcroppings and scrub brush. They were moving into more desolate country, further from civilization with each passing mile. Mrs. Whitmore, she said desperately. Surely we can work something out. The gold claim is big enough for both of us. I'm afraid not, dear. You see, once we reach the next water stop, I'm going to tell Jeremiah Cobb that you've been making threats. Poor man's been worried about having a murderer in the train. Won't take much convincing to have him dispose of the problem. Evangeline's mind raced. She had to find a way out of this. But chained to Samuel's increasingly putrid corpse, her options were limited. The key remained firmly in Mrs. Whitmore's possession, and the woman never seemed to sleep. As if reading her thoughts, the widow chuckled. Don't even think about trying anything heroic, girl. These chains will hold you till kingdom come. But as the afternoon wore on, Evangeline began to notice something. The constant jostling of the wagon was working the nail that secured her shackle to the wagon bed. It wasn't loose by any means, but with each bump and lurch, it shifted slightly. Given enough time and the right leverage, she might be able to work it free. The problem was time. According to her calculations, they'd reach the next water stop by evening. Once they did, her fate would be sealed. She began working at the nail immediately, using Samuel's belt buckle as a makeshift tool. The dead man's body provided cover for her movements, and Mrs. Whitmore seemed content to doze in the afternoon heat. Progress was maddeningly slow. The nail had been driven deep into seasoned oak, and she could only work at it in brief intervals when the widow wasn't watching. But gradually, fraction by fraction, it began to loosen. By late afternoon, sweat was pouring down Evangeline's face from the effort. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the shackles, and her muscles screamed in protest. But the nail was definitely looser now. Perhaps loose enough to pull free if she could get the right angle. Getting restless. Are we? Mrs. Whitmore had awakened from her nap and was watching Evangeline with suspicious eyes. Hard to get comfortable chained to a dead man, Evangeline replied, trying to keep her voice casual. Well, your discomfort won't last much longer. We should reach Willow Creek by sundown. Evangeline's heart sank. Willow Creek was the next water stop, which meant she was running out of time. She redoubled her efforts on the nail, working frantically whenever Mrs. Whitmore looked away. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the wagon train started its descent toward the creek bottom. Evangeline could hear the joyful shouts of the other travelers as they spotted water ahead. The nail was almost free now, held by perhaps an inch of wood. If she could just get a few more minutes. Willow Creek ahead, came the call from the wagon master. We'll make camp here for the night. Mrs. Whitmore smiled triumphantly. End of the line for you, I'm afraid. The wagon lurched to a stop, and Evangeline heard people jumping down, unhitching teams, setting up camp. Soon, Mrs. Whitmore would go find Jeremiah Cobb and spin her tale of threats and danger. This was her last chance. Mrs. Whitmore, she said urgently. Before you go, there's something else you need to know about the gold. The widow paused in gathering her things. What sort of something? It's not just in the creek bed. My father found a cave deeper in the mountains. The vein runs right through it. Pounds and pounds of pure ore just waiting to be picked up off the ground. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes glittered with greed. You're lying. Am I? Why do you think Samuel was so eager to get his hands on the property? The creek find was just the beginning. Evangeline leaned forward as much as her chains would allow, but the cave's location isn't on that map. My father kept it in his head, told only me. The wagon was silent except for the distant sounds of the camp being established. Mrs. Whitmore stared at Evangeline, clearly torn between skepticism and avarice. Even if that were true, she said finally, it doesn't change anything. You're still going to die tonight. Then the location dies with me and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what you missed. It was a desperate gambit, but Evangeline could see it was working. Mrs. Whitmore's resolve was wavering, her grip on the key loosening slightly. You could tell me now, the widow said. Save yourself some unpleasantness, and trust you to let me live. I don't think so. Mrs. Whitmore stood abruptly. Decision made. Then I'll just have to take my chances with what I can find in the creek. Goodbye, Miss Monroe. She moved toward the wagon's exit, but as she did, Evangeline threw all her remaining strength into one final effort. The nail popped free with a sharp crack that was lost in the noise of the settling camp. Moving faster than she'd thought possible, Evangeline swung the loose end of her chain like a whip. It caught Mrs. Whitmore across the back of the head with a sickening thud, and the woman collapsed forward onto the wagon floor. The key flew from her grasp. Skittering across the wooden planks, Evangeline lunged for it, dragging Samuel's corpse with her. Her fingers closed around the brass metal just as Mrs. Whitmore groaned and began to stir. With trembling hands, Evangeline inserted the key into the lock of her shackles. The mechanism was stiff, and for a terrifying moment, she thought it wouldn't turn. Then she heard the blessed click of tumblers falling into place and the iron bands fell away from her wrists. Mrs. Whitmore was trying to sit up, blood trickling from a gash on her scalp. You little Evangeline didn't wait to hear the rest. She grabbed the woman's reticule, knowing it contained a map, and dove out the back of the wagon into the gathering dusk. The camp was a bustle of activity as families prepared their evening meals and tended to their animals. No one paid attention to one more figure moving through the twilight. Evangeline slipped between the wagons like a ghost, heading for the creek and the cover of the willows that gave the water stop its name. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Whitmore calling out in alarm. Help! The prisoner has escaped. She attacked me. Evangeline didn't look back. She crashed through the brush along the creek bank, branches tearing at her dress and scratching her face. The sound of pursuit was growing louder. Men's voices. The bay of hounds that some of the travelers kept for hunting. She splashed across the shallow creek and up the far bank, her wet skirts dragging her down. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and forbidding in the growing night. If she could reach them, she might have a chance to hide until the wagon train moved on. But her strength was nearly spent. 3 days of thirst and hunger, followed by the desperate struggle to escape, had pushed her body beyond its limits. Her legs felt like lead, and her lungs burned with each gasping breath. There she is, came a shout from behind her by the creek. A gunshot rang out and Evangeline heard the bullet whine past her ear. They weren't trying to capture her anymore. Mrs. Whitmore had convinced them she was too dangerous to take alive. She stumbled up a rocky slope using scraggly juniper bushes to pull herself along. More shots echoed through the night, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness below. At the top of the ridge, Evangeline paused to look back. The wagon train's campfires twinkled like stars in the valley, and she could see the dark shapes of men spreading out to search for her. In a few hours, they'd find her trail, and the hunt would resume. But something else caught her attention. A thin column of smoke rising from somewhere deeper in the mountains. Another camp, but not part of the wagon train. Mountain men perhaps, or prospectors heading to the goldfields. It was her only chance. Clutching Mrs. Whitmore's reticule to her chest. Evangeline set off through the night toward that distant fire. The journey through the mountains was a nightmare of stumbling over loose rocks and thorny brush. More than once she lost the smoke trail and had to backtrack, precious time slipping away. But finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the eastern peaks, she smelled wood smoke and coffee. The camp was small, just 2 men and their pack animals in a sheltered draw. They looked up in alarm as she stumbled into their firelight, torn dress hanging in tatters, blood on her face and hands. "Sweet Jesus," breathed one of them, a grizzled man with a gray beard. "What happened to you, miss?" "Please," Evangeline gasped, collapsing beside their fire. "I need help. They're trying to kill me." The 2 men exchanged glances. The second one, younger but equally weatherbeaten, poured her a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. "Who's trying to kill you?" the older man asked gently. Evangeline took a grateful sip of the coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her exhausted body. Then, haltingly, she told them her story. Samuel's attempt to steal her land, the fight in her cabin, the 3 days chained to his corpse, and Mrs. Whitmore's plan to have her murdered. "Name's Isaiah Tompkins," the older man said when she'd finished. "This here's my partner, Moses Crane. We're prospectors heading up to the Montana goldfields." Moses nodded solemnly. "Sounds like you got yourself in a heap of trouble, miss. But killing a man, even in self-defense, that's serious business." "I know," Evangeline said. "But I swear to you, he came at me with a knife. I had no choice." Isaiah studied her face in the firelight. "I believe you got an honest look about you. But this Mrs. Whitmore, she's got the wagon train convinced you're a murderer. She was Samuel's partner. They were planning to steal my gold claim together." Moses leaned forward with interest. "Gold claim? Whereabouts?" Evangeline hesitated, then pulled the reticule from her dress. Inside, along with Mrs. Whitmore's personal effects, was a folded piece of paper. She spread it out by the fire, revealing a crude but detailed map. "Here," she said, pointing to a spot marked with an X, "my father's homestead. There's gold in the creek and possibly more in the mountains above." Isaiah whistled low. "That's prime territory, close to the main trail. Good water, timber for building. Worth killing for, I reckon. The question is," Moses added, "what do we do now? That wagon train's probably still looking for you. And if they catch you," as if summoned by his words, the distant sound of hoof beats echoed through the draw. "The search party had found their trail. Hide her," Isaiah hissed, kicking dirt over the fire in the rocks yonder. Evangeline scrambled behind a pile of boulders just as 3 riders emerged from the pre-dawn gloom. She recognized Jeremiah Cobb's voice immediately. "Morning, gents. You seen a young woman pass this way? Dangerous fugitive killed a man back on the trail." "Haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone," Isaiah replied smoothly. "Just us and the coyotes out here. Mind if we look around? She's armed and desperate, could be hiding anywhere." Evangeline pressed herself deeper into the rocks, hardly daring to breathe. Through a gap in the stones, she could see the riders dismounting, beginning to search the camp. "This is a waste of time," one of them grumbled. "She could be anywhere in these mountains by now. Mrs. Whitmore says she's got information about a gold claim." Cobb replied. "Woman like that might head back toward familiar territory. All the more reason to give up this chase and get back to the train. We got families to think about. Jeremiah can't be chasing every outlaw from here to Oregon." After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the search party remounted and rode away. Evangeline waited until the sound of hoof beats had completely faded before emerging from her hiding place. "Thank you," she said simply. Isaiah spat into the cold ashes of their fire. "Don't thank us yet, miss. You're still in a world of trouble. That wagon train's heading west, and they'll spread word about you at every settlement between here and the Pacific. You'll be a wanted woman from here to California. Then what do you suggest I do?" Moses and Isaiah exchanged a long look, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Well," Moses said slowly, "we're heading to Montana territory anyway, and we could use a partner who knows the local geography." "You mean I mean," Isaiah said, "maybe it's time to beat them to the punch. Get to your claim first. Establish legal ownership and let the law sort out the rest." Evangeline felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. You do that, help me, equal partners, Moses insisted. Share and share alike, whatever we find. But what about the charges against me? The murder warrant. Isaiah waved a dismissive hand. Montana Territory is a big place and the law's mighty thin on the ground. By the time any warrant catches up with you, we'll have enough gold to buy your way clear of any charges. It was a desperate plan fraught with danger and uncertainty. But what choice did she have? Going back to the wagon train meant certain death, and striking out on her own in the wilderness was equally suicidal. All right, she said finally. Partners. They shook hands in the growing light of dawn, sealing a bargain that would determine all their fates. The journey to Montana Territory took 2 weeks of hard travel through some of the most rugged country Evangeline had ever seen. Isaiah and Moses proved to be experienced mountain men, able to find game and water where she would have seen only barren rock and scrub. They traveled by night when possible, avoiding the main trails where they might encounter other travelers. Word of the fugitive murderers had spread quickly through the sparse settlements, and more than once they had to detour around towns where Evangeline's description had been posted, but gradually the familiar landmarks of her father's territory began to appear. The distinctive peak her father had called Lookout Mountain, the bend in the river where he'd first found gold, the stand of ponderosa pines that marked the northern boundary of their claim. There, Evangeline said, pointing to a narrow valley between 2 ridges. That's where the cabin is, or was I don't know what condition it's in after everything that happened. They approached cautiously, but the homestead appeared deserted. Samuel's body had been removed, presumably by members of the wagon train, but dark stains on the cabin floor testified to the violence that had occurred there. Sorry sight, Isaiah murmured, examining the blood stains. Must have been terrible for you. Evangeline nodded, unable to speak. Being back in the place where her father had died, where she'd killed a man and had her life destroyed, brought all the emotions flooding back. But Moses was more practical. Where exactly did your father find the gold? She led them to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Here, she said, kneeling beside a shallow pool with the water eddied around a fallen log. He showed me how to pan for it just before he died. Moses scooped up a pan full of sand and gravel, swirling it expertly in the running water. Within minutes, he'd washed away most of the debris, leaving behind a small accumulation of black sand and something else. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed, holding up a nugget the size of a pea. Pure gold or near enough. Isaiah let out a whoop that echoed off the surrounding hills. We're rich, rich as cries. But even as they celebrated, Evangeline felt a chill of unease. Keep your voices down, she warned. We don't know who might be listening. Her caution proved prescient. That very afternoon, as they were setting up a more systematic mining operation, Moses spotted riders approaching from the south. Compy coming, he announced grimly. 4 of them, armed and moving with purpose. Evangeline's blood ran cold as she recognized the lead rider, Mrs. Whitmore. No longer bothering with her widow's weeds, sat her horse like a man and carried a rifle across her saddle bow. It's her, Evangeline whispered. She's come for the gold. The rider stopped just outside rifle range, and Mrs. Whitmore called out across the creek. Evangeline Monroe, I know you're in there. Come out and face justice. Justice, Evangeline shouted back. You mean murder. You killed Samuel Hartwell in cold blood. The territorial marshal is offering a $1,000 reward for your capture. Dead or alive, I suppose. Mrs. Whitmore's laughter was cold as winter wind. Preferably dead saves the expense of a trial. Isaiah and Moses had taken cover behind the cabin walls. Their rifles ready. 4 of them, Isaiah muttered. Not impossible odds, but not good either. Evangeline studied the approaching riders more carefully. Besides Mrs. Whitmore, she recognized 2 men from the wagon train, drifters who'd signed on as guards. The 4th was a stranger, but his badge and bearing marked him as a lawman of some sort. That's Marshal Davies from Laram, Moses said, following her gaze. Hard man, but fair. If we could get him to listen to our side, he won't, Evangeline said bitterly. Not with $1,000 on my head and Mrs. Whitmore's poison in his ear. The standoff stretched into the afternoon, neither side willing to make the first move. But as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Mrs. Whitmore's patience ran out. Last chance, Monroe. Surrender now, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial. Go to hell, Evangeline shouted back. The response was immediate. Muzzle flashes bloomed from the rider's position and bullets began thudding into the cabin walls. Isaiah and Moses returned fire, their shots carefully aimed to keep the attackers at a distance. The battle raged until full darkness, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But as the night wore on, Evangeline realized they were in a losing position. Mrs. Whitmore's party had better supplies and could afford to wait them out. Eventually, thirst and hunger would force a surrender. We need to get out of here, she told her partners during a lull in the firing. Is there another way out of this valley? Moses nodded toward the north. Game trail leads up into the high country. Rough going, but it comes out near the Montana border. Can we make in the dark? Have to try. Come morning, they'll have us surrounded. They gathered what supplies they could carry and slipped out the back of the cabin just as the moon was setting. The game trail Moses had mentioned was barely visible in the darkness. More of a suggestion than an actual path. For hours they climbed through increasingly rugged terrain, using their hands as much as their feet to navigate the steep slopes. Behind them, the occasional muzzle flash indicated that Mrs. Whitmore's party was still keeping the cabin under siege, unaware that their quarry had escaped. By dawn, they had reached a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the country below. The homestead looked like a child's toy in the distance, and thin columns of smoke showed where Mrs. Whitmore had set fire to the cabin and outbuildings, destroying the evidence, Isaiah said grimly. When the territorial authorities investigate, they'll find nothing but ashes. What about the gold claim? Evangeline asked. Can she just take it over? Moses shrugged. With you branded as a fugitive and no witnesses to contradict her story, probably. The territorial office doesn't ask too many questions when someone files a claim on abandoned property. Evangeline felt tears of rage and frustration burning her eyes. Everything her father had worked for, everything he died to protect was being stolen by the very woman who betrayed him. There has to be something we can do, she said desperately. Maybe there is, Isaiah said thoughtfully. Remember what you told us about there being more gold deeper in the mountains. A cave your father found. Yes, but I don't know exactly where it is. He never had a chance to show me. But you know the general area. Evangeline nodded. He said it was 2 days right north of the cabin up near the tree line. Then that's where we go. Let Mrs. Whitmore have the creek claim. We'll find another load and come back with enough gold to buy the whole territory if we need to. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. As Mrs. Whitmore's smoke continued to rise from the ruined homestead below, the three partners set off deeper into the Montana wilderness. The country they traveled through was unlike anything Evangeline had ever seen. Towering peaks thrust up into the sky like cathedral spires, their slopes covered in dense forests of pine and fir. Crystal clear streams tumbled down from hidden glaciers, and the air was so thin and pure it made her dizzy. They followed elk trails and Indian paths, always climbing higher into the mountains. On the second day, they reached the tree Isaiah had mentioned, where the forests gave way to alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers and scattered boulders. This has to be the area, Evangeline said, studying the terrain. My father described meadows like these and that peak there. He called it Eagle's Nest because of the way it juts up. Moses dismounted and examined the ground carefully. Lot of country to cover. Your father give you any other landmarks? Evangeline closed her eyes, trying to remember her father's excited words from that last conversation. He said there was a waterfall hidden behind a wall of rock. The cave was somewhere near its base. They spent the rest of the day searching, following every stream, and checking every rock formation. As the sun began to set, painting the peaks rose and gold, Isaiah called out from a cluster of boulders near the meadow's edge. Over here, I found something. Evangeline and Moses hurried to where he stood. At first, all she could see was a seemingly solid wall of granite, but as Isaiah led them around to the side, she spotted a narrow gap between two massive stones. The waterfall. She breathed through the gap. She could hear the sound of rushing water. They squeezed through the opening and found themselves in a hidden box canyon. A spectacular waterfall plunged from high above, creating a pool of crystal clear water at its base. And there, behind the cascade, partially hidden by the falling water, was the dark mouth of a cave. My God, Moses whispered. He actually found it. Getting to the cave meant wading through the icy pool and ducking behind the waterfall. The shock of the cold water took Evangeline's breath away, but she pressed on, driven by desperate hope. The cave entrance was larger than it appeared from outside, easily wide enough for a man to walk upright. Isaiah struck a match, and in its flickering light they could see the passage extending deep into the mountain. "We need torches," he said. "Can't explore properly with just matches." They returned to their camp and fashioned crude torches from dead pine branches and strips of cloth soaked in lamp oil. Then, armed with light and their mining tools, they ventured into the cave. What they found inside took their breath away. The passage opened into a vast chamber. Its walls shot through with veins of pure gold. In the torch light, the metal gleamed like captured sunlight. More wealth than any of them had dreamed possible. Sweet Mary and Joseph, Isaiah breathed, were looking at fortune that would make the California gold rush look like pocket change. Moses was already examining the veins with a prospector's eye. "This isn't placer gold that you pan from streams. This is hard rock mining. You'd need proper equipment, blasting powder, a whole operation." "But it's definitely gold," Evangeline asked. "Pure as the day God made it." "Your father wasn't just a dreamer, miss. He was a visionary." They spent hours exploring the cave system, finding chamber after chamber lined with precious metal. By Evangeline's rough calculations, there was enough gold here to supply the entire Western Territories for decades. But as they made their way back to the entrance, reality began to set in. Finding the gold was one thing. Extracting it and getting it to market was quite another. They had no equipment, no supplies, and no legal claim to the property. Worse, Mrs. Whitmore was still out there, probably spreading word about the murderers who'd escaped justice. Even if they could mine the gold, they'd never be able to sell it openly without risk of capture. "We need help," Evangeline said as they sat around their campfire that night. "Someone with connections, equipment, and the legal standing to file proper claims." "I might know someone," Isaiah said thoughtfully. "Fellow named Jack Morrison owns a freight company out of Helena. Honest as the day is long, and he's got the resources to mount a proper mining operation. Can we trust him with our lives? Jack and I served together in the Mexican War. Save my hide more than once down in Chihuahua." Moses nodded agreement. "I know Morrison, too. Good reputation, fair dealer. If anyone can help us, it's him." "Then that's our play," Evangeline decided. "We go to Helena, tell Morrison our story, and hope he believes us." The journey to Helena took another week of hard travel through mountain passes and river valleys. They moved carefully, avoiding settlements and staying off the main roads. Twice they spotted wanted posters bearing Evangeline's description nailed to trees at river crossings. Helena, when they finally reached it, was a booming mining town that had grown up almost overnight around gold discoveries in the surrounding hills. The streets were crowded with prospectors, merchants, gamblers, and all the other characters drawn by the promise of easy wealth. Jack Morrison's freight office was located in the center of town, a solid building that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Morrison himself proved to be a bear of a man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Isaiah Tompkins, you old rascal," he boomed when they entered his office. "Heard you were dead, killed by Indians up in the Bitter Roots. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Isaiah replied with a grin. "Jack, I need to talk to you about a business proposition. But first, we need your word that what we discuss stays private." Morrison's expression grew serious. "That depends on whether you're asking me to break any laws." "Nothing illegal, Jack, but it's complicated." For the next hour, they told Morrison the entire story. Evangeline's father and his gold discovery. Samuel Hartwell's attempt to steal the claim. The fight that left him dead, Mrs. Whitmore's scheme, and their desperate flight into the mountains. Morrison listened without interruption, his poker face revealing nothing. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied them for a long moment. "That's quite a tale," he said finally. "And you're asking me to believe that this young lady here is both an innocent victim and the key to the richest gold strike in Montana Territory." "I know how it sounds," Evangeline said, "but I swear to you, every word is true." "The cave exists," Moses added. "We've seen it with our own eyes. More gold than you can imagine." Morrison stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the bustling street below. Even if I believe your story, and I'm not saying I do, there are practical problems. Miss Monroe here is a wanted fugitive. The territorial marshal has a $1,000 bounty on her head. We know, Isaiah said. That's why we need your help. What exactly are you proposing? Isaiah leaned forward. You file the mining claims in your name. We provide the location and guide you to the site. You supply the equipment, men, and legal protection. We split the profits 4 ways. You, me, Moses, and the lady. And what about the murder charges? With enough gold, we can afford the best lawyers in the territory. Maybe even get the case heard by a federal judge instead of some local magistrate in Mrs. Whitmore's pocket. Morrison was quiet for a long time, clearly weighing the risks and rewards. Finally, he turned back to face them. I'll need proof, he said. Something more than just your word that this gold cave exists. Moses reached into his pack and produced a chunk of quartz shot through with golden veins. We brought samples. Have your say or test them. Morrison examined your specimen with the eye of an experienced miner, even to Evangeline's untrained gaze. The gold content was obviously substantial. All right, he said at last. I'm interested, but we do this my way with proper precautions. Miss Monroe stays out of sight until we can figure out how to handle the legal situation. And if this turns out to be some elaborate confidence game, it's not, Evangeline said firmly. I just want my father's killer brought to justice and his legacy protected. Fair enough. Give me a week to arrange financing and equipment. Then we'll take a ride up to your cave and see what we're really dealing with. True to his word, Morrison had everything organized within 7 days. A pack train loaded with mining equipment, supplies, and armed guards wound its way out of Helena toward the high country. Evangeline rode with them, disguised as a young man to avoid recognition. The return journey to the cave took on an almost surreal quality. Here she was, retracing her desperate flight with a small army of miners and armed guards, heading toward what might be the richest gold strike in the Torito's history. When they finally reached the hidden canyon, and Morrison saw the cave for himself, his composure finally cracked. Sweet suffering Christ, he breathed, staring at the gold-veined walls and the torchlight. You weren't exaggerating. This is beyond anything I've ever seen. His mining engineer, a Cornish man named Thomas Penrose, was equally impressed. Conservative estimate Mr. Morrison were looking at millions of dollars in recoverable ore, maybe tens of millions. Within days, Morrison had transformed the remote canyon into a bustling mining camp. Tents sprouted like mushrooms. Mining equipment was hauled up the narrow trails, and the sound of picks and shovels echoed off the canyon walls. But even as the operation took shape, the specter of Evangeline's legal troubles loomed over everything. Morrison had hired a team of lawyers to research her case, and their initial findings were not encouraging. The problem, explained lead attorney Silas